Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 2020 Latinx New Play Festival with San Diego Rep and the Historical Context Panel. I'm Maria Patrice Amon, the executive producer for the festival, and I would like to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands of the Kumeyaay. I want to thank our sponsors, the California Arts Council, the San Diego Union Tribune, and Dylan Jacobs. As an online festival, we don't have printed festival programs to share with you, but we do have digital versions, and they are available on the reception page, as long with also a Meet the Artist packet and a dramaturgy packet with all kinds of information about the readings that you're going to be seeing this weekend. We encourage you to use the chat box on the right side of your screen to share with us where you're coming in from. You can expand or minimize the chat box with the little white button at the top of the box. Additionally, we want to acknowledge that these are live streams to you, and with liveness comes the possibility of technical difficulties. We ask in advance for your patience. In case that does occur, we will have a team on our end working on it to quickly clarify the situation. On your end, if you run into technical difficulties, we ask you to let us know by chatting to the text line, the San Diego Rep text phone number. You can reach it at 619-940-6091. Okay, those are all of the announcements that I needed to share with everyone. I have one more. Okay. I think that's all that we needed to cover. I want to welcome to the stream Jade Power Sotomayor, Dr. Jade Power Sotomayor, who will be leading our panel today. So Jade, if we can bring you right up, we will. Hey, Jade.
Good afternoon.
Jade is also one of the dramaturgs for the festival this weekend and was on the dramaturgy panel as well. So we've got Jade all over the festival this year, and I'm so excited that you're able to join us as the moderator. Okay, so I'm gonna mute my camera and take myself off and let you take it from here.
Thank you. I want to give a special thanks and congratulations to Patrice, Dr. Patrice, and everyone at Amigos del Rep and the Latinx New Play Festival for this beautiful festival that, despite the fact that it's been online, has very much felt like a festival, and it's beautiful work. Here I am at the site of the San Diego Latinx New Play Festival, traditional homelands of the Kumeyaay, with whom I try to and strive to be in relation at all times, as well as this is a zona fronteriza that also is an important aspect of this region, and of the also a frontera that has long since divided indigenous communities to think about not just the nation states that occupy either side of it. And we're here to talk about, to provide a little bit of a historical context for this movement that we are currently a part of, and that we're witnessing, and that we're participating in. And I think it's a beautiful that Patrice has organized this part of the festival. Last year, when you walk in the festival, you see all of these playwrights, and starting with Sor Juana Inez, right? And so to think about trajectories, to think about genealogies, but also the practice of honoring elders and eldership, and what does it mean to come from somewhere? What does it mean to trace different lineages, and also ask questions and ask new questions, and how do the questions evolve, and perhaps circle back, expand. So that's some of what we're going to talk about today in our brief 45 minutes with our incredible panelists. I want you all to know that because we're online, we have been able to bring in the most exciting and innovative and kind and expressive and brilliant people that are thinking and writing and talking about Latinx theater today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists, and I'm just going to call you all up. You can turn your cameras on now, folks. And I'm just going to introduce you one by one, and perhaps you can tell us where you're coming from, and also one thing you want us to know about you. I have these lengthy bios because the people that are here today are very accomplished. They have many lines, many things they have written and places they have been, but really I want you to hear what they have to say. So I'll let you choose what it is that you want to share with us. about from your bio today when you also tell us where you're from. So let's start with Patricia, mi hermana Patricia, because you're right up next to me right there. Dr. Patricia Herrera.
Hello. I know, Herrera's in the house. Somebody in the audience says there's also an Herrera, so that's cool to know. I'm sure for many cultural lineages and histories. Thank you so much for this wonderful festival, Patrice, Victoria, and the entire team. I am Patricia Herrera. I am joining you from North Chesterfield, Virginia, traditional territory of the Powhatan people, and also the former capital of the Confederacy. So those entangled history of colonization and slavery are deep here and have divided people. Introduce myself. I'm a scholar, art maker, dramaturg, mother of 3, sister, daughter. I just recently finished a project called Entre Puerto Rico and Richmond, which I think I'll bring up. It was a multimedia installation and film that took place in a tobacco factory that was being demolished, but that it's the same factory that also was in Puerto Rico and Richmond. And so there's interesting ties between the history of tobacco and Puerto Rico and Richmond.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And also, I forgot to mention, well, since we have this wonderful chat feature, perhaps folks could plug their books, their publications, their social media handles, so that folks can follow you. And I'm gonna turn now to Dr. Brian Herrera, who has lots of those to share.
Hello, yes, I am Brian Herrera. I am calling from Princeton, New Jersey, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Nanticoke Lenape people. It is also to sort of invoke the sort of similar tradition as my prima. It's also the space where the Constitutional Congress convened, and also just a few, not too far from where Washington crossed the Delaware. So again, these sort of histories converging and colliding in all kinds of ways, and trying to bring that forward in our work. So I am a historian of U.S. popular performance with a focus on gender and sexual, how popular performance reveals gender and sexual and race information. And my specialization is U.S. Latino performance, especially in the 20th century, but also in the 21st. And the thing I'm going to tag as a current project is I've recently relaunched a newsletter I run, new subscription under TheaterClick. And so I'm going to put that in there, and I hope you'll consider subscribing. It's a place I try to aggregate some of the most interesting and compelling and worth noting writing about contemporary theater and performance. And because I'm doing it, it means there's a lot of Fornés, there's a lot of Latino stuff, there's just a lot of stuff that'd probably be interested to the folks in the room. So if you haven't subscribed, I think it might be useful for you, and I hope you do.
It's great. Thank you so much. Dr. Trevor Boffone.
Thank you for having me. I see all of my friends in the chat, and I'm very excited. A little nervous too. But I'm Trevor Boffone. I'm from Houston, Texas, on the lands of the Sana, Aracapa, and Karankawa peoples. And I don't want to take up a lot of time here, but the thing that I think is most relevant, I guess right now, would be 50 Playwrights Project, which is a website, digital space that I created about 5 years ago, to document Latinx playwriting and give playwrights a place to talk about their work and amplify what they're doing. And so, yeah, you can see that in the chat. And the thing I'm working on now, and actually is a book about dancing. And so I'll drop my Instagram in the chat, and you might want to go look at that after the panel, okay? After the panel.
Thank you. And Dr. Olga Sanchez.
Woohoo, doctor, it's so exciting. I'm a newly minted PhD, very excited to be here on this panel with illustrious, brilliant minds. I am a longtime affiliated with Milagro Theater in Portland, Oregon, originally from New York, then went out to the Northwest, was AD for them. I'm now emerita, currently dramaturging Dia de Muertos, that's gonna happen online, which is very exciting. Yay. Let's see. So I have an article or two out there, things in the works. I am honored to be a part of the Encuentro anthology that was edited by Dr. Boffone, and with also Chantal Rodriguez and Teresa Marrera. So very excited to be a part of that. And my focus is contemporary Latinx theater and history. and focusing also on the work of the Latinx Theater Commons and how the Commons is a function of a tool for movement, for moving the needs that we have out into the forefront. So happy to be here.
Wonderful. So as you can see, we have a lot of projects, a lot of years of work and being in the field and being in space with each other and asking questions. And so in our short time, I have some questions that I've pre-circulated to the panelists. And I'm going to read it out. This is a multiple part question, and then I will also put it in the chat as well. So, but it's a kind of a larger question of the moment, and I want us to think about how Latinx theater is intersecting with that. So the question reads as such: as theaters across the country reckon with historical and current racist practices and actively embrace anti-racism as an ethos, what are some lessons that can be gleaned from examining Latinx theater history and the different movements that comprise it? In other words, people have been sounding this alarm for decades. What has worked and what hasn't worked in terms of creating spaces for Latinx stories, bodies, worldviews within and also outside of mainstream theater? How has colorism persisted in Latinx theater, and more importantly, why? In your view, what are some of the best practices for making and engaging with anti-racist theater? How's that for a question? Thank you. And I will just, so I see Brian's hand up, so just go for it, and we'll just, anyone who wants to have at it, go for it, and then we'll just go as it develops. So thank you.
Thanks for that question, Jade. It's an impossible question because it covers it's a many sort of multiple points, but it's also, I think it's actually a good question for all of us to hold on to as we continue into the months ahead, because it does track priorities, and in some ways the priorities of how do we want to lead and press the conversation simultaneously. One thing I will say, and this is my main hit on this, is I do think that one of the pieces about this moment that we're in is U.S. Latinx theater has in some ways been, as you say, doing this all the way along. And in some ways, I think it's worth reminding that U.S. Latinx theater has all of, on the one hand, training non-Latinx folks to see, to hear, to value, to respect the complexity of Latinidad. Part of that project has also been Latino theater makers speaking to other Latino theater makers, encouraging them to see, to hear, to value, and to respect the differences within Latinidad. So it's always been this dual project about witnessing and being witnessed in kind of reciprocal ways, sometimes by clueless, hostile audiences, and sometimes by clueless but solid audiences, like folks, other Latinx theater makers who are in solidarity. So it is that dual project. And I do think I think we are facing a moment where U.S. Latinx theater makers really need to reckon with the habits of anti-Blackness and the habits of not recognizing Blackness as a sort of constitutive feature of Latinidad, not just in word, but in action and deed. And then likewise also the ways in which U.S. Latinx theater has tended to either fetishize or erase indigeneity. So this dual task that U.S. Latino theater really must reckon with some of its habits about how it chooses to engage these questions that are at the forefront of our moment. And so I think the good thing is U.S. Latinx theater has been sort of in the business of doing this. So let's just get on to keep doing it and keep figuring out how to listen, how to value, and how to respect each other, and make sure that when we do that, we are in training audiences outside of Latinidad to do the same.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I would add to that also, whiteness, right? So not just anti-Blackness and not just the kind of fetishization of indigeneity, but how is whiteness functioning within Latinx theater?
Yeah, the white adjacency and the peculiar white fragility of Latinidad, the peculiar way that white fragility manifests in Latinidad is something right in there in terms of anti-Blackness, the erasure fetishization of indigeneity, and the silence around the white adjacency and our sort of the proximate whiteness that many folks often cling to.
Thank you very much. Olga.
Yeah, that was brilliantly put, Brian. Thank you. And I think I just want to add that one of the kind of tactics or strategies, which we saw last night actually in Marga's performance, was the doing it ourselves. the stepping forward, and even when there are conflicts within our community, there's way in which we go back to the history and we look at teatro poesia, the women's movement of poetry plus theater as a response to the entrenched masculinity in teatro chicano. And how women seeking a voice and seeking a representation that was beyond the virgin whore, that was beyond light and dark, and darkness certainly was an issue in casting. We know from complaints that happened about issues that were going on, where the Virgen de Guadalupe always had to be very lighter skinned, fairer, quote unquote, and if you weren't, then you were, among the people who were not. You were the devils, or you were the men, or you were a non-gendered being in a very binary world. Similarly, the voices of LGBTQ performers who stepped forward, like Marga, I'm blanking on names, but people who stepped forward, particularly in the 90s, to make their presence known, particularly as solo performers, again, in resistance against a perhaps dominant Latinx or Chicanx kind of framework of performance. And then more recently, our Afro-Latinx who are stepping forward, like Crystal Roman, saying in her play Black Latina, I am here and I'm doing theater and I'm having issues with this. And part of it is how people are being represented, being seen, being counting themselves. So part of it is the act of self-acknowledgement, theatricalized, performed, and pushing against a framework that doesn't include us, whoever us might be.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I like how you also, the way that the construct of the of Latinidad is also very gendered in and of itself, right? So then that also calls for all of these other boundaries against which to push. Patricia, you were gonna.
Thank you so much, Brian and Olga. I just want to build on thinking about like the anti-racist theater practices. What does it mean for Latinx theater to think about anti-racist practices? And in some ways, we've, like Brian has said and Olga has said, there's a tension between the color of your skin or your indigenous identity, and then fully claiming that Latinidad. So in this recent project, Entre Puerto Rico and Richmond, one of the questions that we asked ourselves is, what is it that we're doing to contribute to Black liberation? And that made me think about, what is Latinx theater doing to contribute in Black liberation, which includes our Afro-Latinx people and community, right? And so asking that question really shifts the way we engage with each other, the way we think about our work, and it really gets us into interrogating what race and racism looks in the US in the context of where you're at and the people that you're relating with.
Yeah, and the thing I keep going back to, I'm sorry. Yeah, right. The thing I keep going back to is these like major pop culture moments that have happened in the last few years. And it kind of, it didn't start with Black Panther, but when Black Panther came out, there was this common thing on social media in the Latinx community that I kept seeing, where it was, when are we going to get a Black Panther, right? And then you had Afro-Latinx people who were saying, well, Black Panther represents us, and we saw that this year. You saw all these memes and signs, Latinx for Black Lives Matter, right? Which is exclusionary, right? And it doesn't see Black people as part of the community. And so I look at those things, and it reminds me of, and also being on the producing end of things, I don't engage in art making much at all. Well, I do, but mostly I produce and do behind the scenes stuff. And you see these conversations in places where it's predominantly one type of Latinx person. And I mean, like Latinx Theater Commons I'm part of, I think we're all part of here, where it's very much a certain type of person for the most part. And anytime it's looking to really branch out and bring people in, it's like, okay, let's get an Afro-Latinx play, right? Or a play that looks at indigeneity, right? Rather than really going back, I think to me it's going back and going to the roots of the organization or the theater company or the syllabus and finding places to create inclusion, right? Before you're producing it. Because when we produce things, if like I'm trying to think of a company, let's say like mythical white company in Houston, I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, produces, a Luis Alfaro play, right? And they have no one on staff that, you know, has that cultural competency, then you have issues that can come in, you know, into play, right? Whereas if the people are working at the theater, if the right team is doing that work with cultural competency, and it isn't, to me, it's not just Latinx people. It's because, I mean, do we want Ted Cruz producing, you know, Latinx work? I don't know, you might. But it's really finding and training people in that cultural competency so that when they do the work, it's done in a meaningful way that can bring communities in a sustained way that allows it to, you know, reverberate and continue over time.
Yeah, and I like that. What I hear you saying also is that we need to be careful about othering, right? Othering Afro-Latinx theater, even within Latinx theater, right? So that it's fulfilling this quota. We don't want to get into this relationship where it's fulfilling its quota, but actually to interrogate Latinidad as censoring and Blackness and indigeneity and all of these questions, right? So that it's not just the other two Latinx identity, which is coded white. Yes, Olga.
So to that point, I think part of it is acknowledging a historic relationship with mestizaje and this myth of a blended identity, and not seeing the harm that has been created prior to that with the hierarchy created by the Spanish fundamentally when they came in and they had to organize people because there was so much sex happening and people being born of all sorts of identities and people acknowledging their children, but nevertheless, children who had particular backgrounds were able to get particular jobs. And so colorism emerges from that because that's how you can tell is phenotypically. And it ended up being subsumed when the Spanish were booted out. Then suddenly you have like, oh, well, we're all one people. But those things stayed there. And the challenge is that we don't acknowledge it, but we have this range of identities, right? That emerge out of mixing. Yes. In that range, I'm sorry, one more tiny thing. We confront the United States that is so black and white that suddenly we suddenly have to choose and or be chosen. In some cases, we have no choice. So what Brian was talking to earlier about the proximity to whiteness, that's where the power is. That's where the access is, right? And so this is survival to a certain extent. It's just the thing is so complex.
Beautiful, thank you. Patricia, and then I want to move on to one of the other questions and also leave us a little bit of time for questions from the folks in the chat. But go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to add, you know, it's one thing to say I'm not racist, and the other thing is to really ask how is this form of theater moving the conversation forward in terms of equity and inclusivity? And I think those are the questions that we want to be, and liberation, exactly. And so those are the questions that we want to be asking every time we're in community making art, right? What is this doing to help contribute to Black liberation, right? And so I think if we trace some of those Latino plays, they're not necessarily thinking about that, right? I would say, right, there's a split there, right? Those that are the political theater that's happening in the 1970s that's thinking about race and ethnicity, but then there's also the bifurcation of gender, sexuality that goes along as well. So it's complicated and layered, but interrogation is the biggest thing, right?
Yes.
And I'm going to jump in just before we go on to the next question, is because I do think one of the key things to remember is one of the bad habits that Latinos themselves fall into, which the mainstream U.S. culture insists on, is the idea that Latinos are new, and so I think in this case, what we have to acknowledge is that the complicated tensions around Afro-Latinx experience is something we can track back in any prior Latino history moment, and yet what we have not done is done that. We have not looked and charted and tracked the ways in which Afro-Latinx performers had no space in Latino theater. So there was sort of another forcing that happened there too. So I do think one of the things we need to be alert to in this moment when there is a different reckoning around whiteness, around indigeneity, and around Blackness is not to think that this is a new discovery, that in some ways these have been fought before and the battles were painful when they were fought before. But just because we don't know that history doesn't mean that history is not there. So it's always worth going back to check whenever we're doing something to see where was the Blackness question in this moment, where was indigeneity in this moment, and where was whiteness in this moment, because it's going to be there, even if it's not on the face or not on how the story is traditionally told, even in our own historiography.
It's such an important point, and that is really the thesis of Brian's book, Latin Numbers. But really, and also it's an argument for studying history, right? That the idea that there does seem to be this moment now where it's like this discovery of Afro-Latinidad, which is absolutely part of the problem that it's framed in that way, right? I want to just follow up with another question. We've already kind of touched on it a little bit, but you know, we're currently seeing a whole new generation of Latinas claiming their voices as theater artists. Can you talk about earlier generations from the 70s, 80s, 90s who broke barriers, laid the groundwork for what was to follow? And what are some of the aesthetic practices they engaged in? And how have these influenced future generations? And I think we've already touched on this, but if you have other things to comment on about that specifically, I would love to hear, and I'm sure the folks would love to hear about that as well. Yes.
So really briefly, I mentioned Teatro Poesía, which was a way in which women had a chance to take poetry that was being created. And I think last night somebody shouted out this bridge called My Back. And so one of the early pieces was like, let's take this work and like get it on its feet and recite it. And I think there's that long history of declamación, you know, the poetry, the declamation, but this was more physical. And so it was a marriage of poetry and theater, and as such, also very personal. And you saw the same thing emerge with the New York Poets Cafe and the work there of Eva Gaste Soro, Janice Astor del Valle, these pieces that were one woman, multiple characters, personal about their lives, about coming out, about a variety of different experiences that they were experiencing as women, putting their stamp on the theatrical landscape. So
Patricia's new book, hot off the press. Go out and get it. Run, don't walk.
Sorry.
Can you tell us about that, Patricia?
Yes. So Olga, I was like jumping off my seat when you started talking. So it's exactly that. I think Marga Gomez actually is a great reminder of how much the body politics and embodiment was really much in aesthetics of the 70s. And the New York Poets Cafe were a big part of thinking about how do vocal performances and going out to the streets and trying to captivate your audience or community members through the vocal performance, right? The declamación, as really part of what it means to do theater, right? Or to do performance. And I think that kind of relationship between the body, the voice is something that we want to kind of think about as we are engaging in this mediated form of how the body is truncated in some ways. A lot of the shows that we've seen is really right up here, and we don't see the body in motion. We don't see the body connecting. It's connecting through the screen, right? But it's not connecting through the live person, which is, you know, the essence of theater. So those are things that I'm thinking about that really hold the anchor of the New York aesthetic, is how to make the invisible visible, and orality and embodiment were two of those elements.
And I'll sort of tag on to that, because one of the things that is, in addition to the question of the body, which is one of the ways that we have pretty legible, sort of can track that genealogy, but there's still more to that genealogy that we can explore. I also think that the question of formal, like what I like to call formal defiance, or the defiance of formal convention, and the way that that leads to certain Latinas, like the ones I think of often are Maria Irene Fornés, Caridad Svich, Dolores Prida, Virginia Gris, all of these folks who work on the edges of what looks like a play. And this long tradition in Latinx, and this connects because so many of these things sort of have their connection to poetry and solo performance, but it also is like, what is a script? And that's one of the most important traditions of what, in Teatro Luna too, you know, it's like these traditions of building performances that are outside of conventional dramaturgical legibility. And that leads to a way in which things get easily forgotten or easily historically neglected. And I do think that that is one of the spaces, as we're in this space of formal defiance where form is changing, how are Latina writers like Virginia Gris, for example, inventing new modes in front of our eyes, but we don't know yet to recognize them as drama or as theater. And so how can we keep our superpowers tuned to what the Latinas are doing, because they're likely doing what we need to pay attention to.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
No, just thank you for that point. I want to highlight the point about the fact that it's, you know, for those of us who teach and how it is that we create an archive, right? What is, if we don't even, you know, have a way to call these things theater, to call these things a play, then they just simply get left out of the archive. Thank you. Trevor, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that piggybacking off was Virginia Grease, A Farm for Meme, which was done at Princeton and on HowlRound TV. But I felt, I really don't like Zoom theater. I just forget. Nothing against this weekend. I'm not talking about this weekend. I'm just talking in general. And I thought it was just so brilliant because it was something that really I felt adapted to the form, to the online format. But I do work with playwrights. And so the thing I really, in regards to this question and conversation is really, I look at playwright trees, like mentor trees, and how, you know, the big artists of Fornes, Cherry Moraga, Josefina Lopez, right, in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, how the work that they did actually is still, you know, seeing the effects today, right? And so I look at Josefina Lopez, for instance, at Casa 0101 Theater in Boyle Heights, and how she has mentored this entire generation of playwrights, Mercedes Flores Islas. They have the Chicanas Cholas y Chisme Festival, which has been going on for 6 or so years. And I know there's some people in the chat who have been involved in that. And also just looking at, you know, for instance, Anne Garcia Romero and Migdalia Cruz, Caridad Spitch, and how they have really, you know, carried on the legacy of Fornes, right? With, I just saw Diana Borbano's comment. Yeah, I mean, these women have just done an insane amount of work, right? Mentoring and making sure that this torch is passed on, right? It's also about, you know, paying it forward and creating a culture where, you know, the younger generation is learning that a part of being in this community is to pass it on, right?
Thank you for that. And which is, I mean, as I said at the beginning of the panel, that's part of the learning history is not just to kind of accumulate facts, but is also to place yourself within the genealogy and then to figure out what you're going to do to, as Patricia has so beautifully said, to kind of continue this project of liberation. I have one more question, and then I hope to open, and I'll keep it brief, but I hope to open it up to some questions from the folks in the chat. But we've already kind of mentioned this, but if you have anything else to say, that in this moment of remote theater, though this moment of remote theater may seem earth-shattering and disorienting in so many ways, this is not the first time that new technologies have been folded into theatrical practice. Can you comment on this history and gesture towards what you think the future holds? Are there ways that theater makers and Latinx theater makers specifically stand to benefit or lose from these changes?
So
go for it.
Yeah. So some things, again, as the person that doesn't like Zoom theater, I actually am very interested in this. And I think what we're seeing, and I've been talking to a lot of different people around the country, is we're seeing an increase in equity. I'm not saying pay, but in bringing people to the table. So I've talked to people, going back to the first conversation, who do work in, say, Kansas and have not been able to cast Afro-Latinx plays. And all of a sudden, they have actors all over the country that they can work with for a table reading, you know, on Zoom or something public-facing. But I do want to point out that there have been a number of theaters and people that have been doing this work before, and they actually are kind of on the, they're like on the cutting edge. So Teatro Luna West, which is in Boyle Heights in the former Real Women Have Curves studio, but they've been doing, you know, once a week, like a playwriting class, a writing workshop on Instagram Live. And then something that happened, you know, in the last few months has been the Latinx playwrights or Super Friends, Latinx, Super Friends, Latinx playwrights, some combination of those words on HowlRound that Slavok Rivas has curated. And so it's these free, you know, artistic opportunities, playwriting workshops. There's also been the Latinx Playwright Circle in New York, which, you know, historically is a very, like, you have to have 2 hours of your day to go to this theater in New York. And now there's people all over the country who are going to these weekly workshops. So it's creating more community, it's creating more access. I don't know that it addresses the issue of like pay inequity and those sorts of things, but I think these are things that, from what I've, you know, talked to, people I've talked to, thanks for Brian for putting it there. From people I've talked to, these are things they want to continue even if pandemic ends tomorrow and everything's perfect. These are things that I think they want to see, you know, have life.
Thank you.
I really appreciate that point, Trevor, about access. The access has been made available by this. I'm thinking about, this question made me think about the the format itself. And it made me think about the ubiquity or the ubiquitousness of projections, and how 30 years ago, projections wasn't a thing in the same way that it is now, almost ubiquitous. The way that if you go back 100 years, like we had gaslight, right? We didn't have, or whatever, oil lamps. We didn't have electric lights. They were dangerous, actually. But anyhow, so I'm thinking about this as like a progression. Is this going to be a new format? Now, I think to Patricia's point earlier, theater is a visceral event for me, but this is a different kind of performance. So what are we getting here? I'm thinking about the way that Latinx theater for me, and one of the things that has always charged me about doing Latinx theater has been, one, the poetry, which speaks to Patricia's point about the word, but also the capacity for not only the visceral experience, but the visual experience. What are the colors in the space? What's the lighting in the space? What's the fabric in the space? And all of those things that to me have just been part of my theater making, things that I care about very profoundly, in a vibrant way, in a, like, here's my eyes. So how is that, how does what we put in this box reflect that opportunity to bring a visual aesthetic forward? And then also a sonic one, because that's also part of this. So these kind of questions are what's coming up for me in terms of how this thing might transform how we think about both the larger space and this space in and of itself.
Yes, thank you.
I'm going to add.
We've also been given another 5 minutes for our panel, by the way.
Okay, great. One of the things I will add, though, is I do think two things is, on the one hand, I do think what we're beginning to understand is what live presence together is needed for and what it's not, and what kind, just like we have 61 people in this audience on a Sunday afternoon for this topic, there might be certain kinds of events that don't need presence. What are the events that like, how do we value presence in a different way as we move forward? Because I do think it has activated collaborations and conversations in all kinds of ways over the last 6 months that have been a shock, that have been surprising to me. The other thing I will say is that the Latinx theater community has actually been activating digital connectivity in really powerful and dynamic ways for the last 6 or 8 years. The Latinx Theater Commons could not have happened without the leaning into digital connectivity. Likewise, 50pp and what Trevor has done with that has been leveraging the social media, what Teatro Luna has done. Like, so this is also building on a tradition within Latinx theater of the last 10 years that is something now everybody else is doing it too. So what is the ways in which forward and don't get lost in the way? Because that's one of always the risks of what Latinx theater makers is. They're often on the front edge of something and then they get forgotten as the edge moves, as everybody else starts paying attention. But I will say that this, I think our opportunity here is, these tools are not going away. What we're going to be what it'll be interesting to see is how are they integrated and incorporated in ways that further connection, equity, and liberation, and which are the ways that they end up perpetuating exclusion. That's the thing we all need to remain alert to, because these tools will remain.
Absolutely, absolutely, and thank you for that, Brian. And I would add to that too that the reason that you have this kind of sort of era of interconnectivity through social media and through the internet is precisely because of the need to have other Latinx folks with whom to be in community, and perhaps the ways that people aren't getting that in their, locally or whatever it is. So that it's speaking directly to the kind of isolation that is experienced and the hunger for connection that is specific to Latinx experience as a theater maker. Patricia, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about in the same way that we've positioned our Latinx, a lot of the women theater makers, as pushing those conventions and theater conventions. I think part of the work here that we have the opportunity to do is also, how do we push the convention of what we're forming right now? Because it's almost a pattern, right? Right now it's a pattern. This is how we're gonna do it. But clearly, like Vicky and other playwrights, they're really thinking innovatively of how we interweave this mediated form, and how does it change the way we do and be, right? Because right now it seems that we're in the pattern of doing it this way, and it's fairly new, but it's almost asking the question, what conventions do we need to break, as we continue to create this form right here?
Just a
Thank
last
you
thought.
so much for that. Yeah, one more comment, and then I want to open it up for folks who want to start putting any questions that they have on the chat. Just start putting them in there. We have about 11 minutes left with these.
Real quick, it's just the thought that, and again, back to Patricia's point earlier, was how the word becomes so important in this space. the voice and the voice, but the word. And I've really appreciated the plays of the last 2 days, the last 3 plays, and Marga's last night, and the one we're going to hear later on this afternoon. For the script, performances were brilliant, direction was excellent, but the text.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, at the same time, what about the bodies, right? And because so for some of us, we're interested in, the text and the body, and a lot of us are, right? So what happens to the body in this moment, and how can we continue to push up against the sort of text centrism of a lot of that we have identified in some ways as a kind of Eurocentric logic in and of itself, even as we explore all, dig deeper into and lean more into the power of the word and poetry. Yeah. So here's some questions from the chat. There was a question earlier that said, how do you survive a Eurocentric white theater environment like education areas or regional jobs? I'm just gonna put these questions out there, and then here's a couple, and then we can maybe take them up together. What advice do you have for the next generation of Latinx theater makers that want to continue decolonizing the theater and ourselves? All right.
Okay, 2 thoughts. One, in terms of resistance in the academy, I think that one reason we're here is because we're trying to infiltrate. I know that I specifically, and because of the work with the Latinx theater, went into academia so that I could bring my years of experience as a Latinx theater maker and my concern for Latinx theater making and my love of Latinx theater to a conversation with students and fellow faculty. And that's been interesting. In terms of this generation, work with other Latinx, work with, I know that sounds like whatever, but there's a way in which there was a move about 10 years ago. Everybody wanted to go into the big houses, and you know what I mean? And everybody wanted to get that position, and it ended up being, I'm sure people have had great experiences, but there's also a fair amount of tokenism. There's a fair amount of like battling. There's a way in which, I'm just gonna speak from my personal experience, that working with Milagro for 12 years, was a training. That's all I did was Latinx theater makers, work with some beautiful directors, brilliant playwrights, and that was an education that has allowed me to walk into spaces and go like, I see where you're coming from. I also have a place that I'm coming from. I've trained that. So if there's a Latinx theater around you, or make Latinx, make a company, but also infuse into the companies that exist, because there's a phenomenon here, which is many of our Latinx theater companies, the founders, they've been at it for decades. And we have long-lasting Latinx theaters around this country. But they're getting to the point where it's time to pass the torch. And if you're up for it, there's torches to be handed to you to lead the movement forward. That you don't have to do the same thing they've been doing. You can transform it. I'm just offering that out there.
And I do think that the question is even if you are, as many of us infiltrate the pedagogical structures of the U.S. Academy, there's 5 of us here. I mean, it's not going to be like we're not. So there is a measure of building community and building self-training. One of the best things you can do as I think as any stage career artist at this point is buy yourself or ask your institution to have a subscription to the New Play Exchange. That's one of the great ways where you can learn the names in tandem with resources like Trevor's 50pp and other things, but know the voices, read the words, get to know who else is out there. New Play Exchange, don't wait for it to be published by Samuel French. And it's for an annual individual subscription for New Play Exchange. It's like $12. It's less than most movies in the regular times. And so I think it's explore those resources for yourself, and then find communities locally, and then reach out to folks, because it's. I also think pay attention to writers like who make decoloniality as a central part of their practice. People like Virginia Gris, who we've shouted out a number of times today, central part of what her work is about. So look for those writers, because they have the bibliographies and they have the genealogies that you can learn from as well.
Great advice. Yeah. Patricia?
I'm thinking about the students who we have. I teach at the University of Richmond, predominantly white institution, right? So even our own students are also not necessarily on our side, that we're pushing against their thinking and framing. And so it's not only about infiltrating the institution, but also infiltrating the students in the classroom as well. So I think those are, for me, those are two separate things. There's one thing to be working with colleagues and creating projects or programs or initiatives that would help make equity and inclusivity more accessible at the university. But then there's also what happens in the classroom and how you can use the classroom to really activate this notion of decolonization. And that there's a big challenge, there's big challenges in doing that as well, being able to kind of think about both institutional stuff and also the relational stuff that happen, which is as important. I think in terms of advice, people have mentioned it, the collaboration. I would say co-conspirators. Who are your co-conspirators in this journey? Because there are some that would love to walk with you and probably are so willing, but don't want to be alone. So there are many out there who want to be co-conspirators.
Yeah, and the thing
Thank you for that.
sorry. The thing that I tell people, because a lot of people ask me about Instagram stuff, and with so much of this, with Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, it takes no effort to like a comment, to like a video, to subscribe to someone's YouTube, to comment, to post them on their story. Those things are very easy to do, and they're easy ways to build community, amplify the work of other people. And I think being an artist and being in the arts community is really, I like to think of it as like I'm doing 10% for myself and 90% for other people, or whatever your percentage is. But really, it's about more than the individual. It's about building up the group, right?
I really appreciate the way that all of you are kind of thinking both about what does it mean for Latinx theater artists to do this work and to kind of build themselves and care for themselves, but also what does it mean to educate others about Latinx theater, right? What does it mean for Latinx theater to exist in relation to mainstream theater or non-Latinx theater artists? And what does it mean to co-conspire and at the same time to create spaces that are by, for, and about, right? So I think that some of the questions in the chat we're getting at that, as to how can we both nurture ourselves, but then also how can we share what we have and educate others about what it is that we're what it is that we do.
I just want to, along those lines, I think there's a lot of us are self-educated by way of, a lot of us bring what we know, and part of it is trusting that you know stuff, right? And trusting the choices that you make, and against choices that seem to be the way it's supposed to be done. And that's how you create new art, right? That's kind of common knowledge, but trusting your desire to use a particular element, use a color, use a fabric, use a song, use materials in your own theater making, that whether the play is Latinx or not, how do you as a Latinx, and I'm speaking to Latinx, how do you as a Latinx theater maker infuse who you are in whatever work you touch?
Bit more mercenary is to lift up a comment in the chat is when you choose to spend money on the striving artists, on the artists who don't necessarily have a lot of access to other resources. Hustle your free tickets from the big theaters and pay for your tickets at the small theaters. And if you can't pay for your ticket to the small theater, see what you can do in-kind labor that might support the theater. Because one of the things is folks will spend lots of money on the fancy stuff and will think they need to get the community stuff for free. We need to flip that script as just habit. Pay full price to the smaller artists and look for discounts at the big houses.
And by that same token, also I think that for those of us who teach and in the classroom, we need to do our work to expose folks to the long trajectory of Latinx theater history in the plays, but we also need to uplift contemporary voices and really push against the kind of entrenchment of, Latinx theater was this thing and that's where it stayed.
Bring the artists to our classrooms so easily.
Any final comments from these beautiful panelists before we close off in 1 minute and get on to our next reading today?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for taking an interest in,
Really
in
appreciate
this,
it.
for
Thank
sure.
you.
Beautiful panel. I look forward to being in conversation. And Patricia said that they're going to try to save the chat to see if we can somehow access all the information on the chat. And thank you once again to all our panelists from all your different locations. And I hope our paths all cross again very soon. Much love, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, fellows.
Thank you, Jade.
Thank you, friends. Thank you,
Thank
Jade.
you.
Nice seeing everyone.
Go artists.
Yay, Patrice.
Yes, Patrice.
Yeah, and congrats to all the playwrights for sure for this great weekend.